Silence swallowed the room. Not the peaceful kind of silence. The kind that comes right before something terrible happens. The kind that tastes like blood and fear and the moment between a heartbeat stopping and the realization that it has stopped. Aria Reynolds stood in the middle of the San Francisco diner at 3:22 in the morning, her hands pressed against a dying man's ribs, and she was not thinking about who he was. She was not thinking about the two men in tailored black suits frozen 3 feet away, their hands hovering near weapons they would never draw in time. She was not thinking about the empty diner, the way every customer had fled the moment the gunshot shattered the quiet like a blade through glass. She was thinking about his breathing. How it had stopped. How his chest had gone still beneath her palms. "Call 911, she said. Her voice came out steady. Broken pieces held together by something stronger than bone. Now. The man on the checkered linoleum floor was tall. Expensive. His suit, black silk, tailored, worth more money than Aria had seen in her entire life, was now torn open across the ribs. Blood poured from a bullet wound like rain from a broken sky, soaking into the white shirt beneath, spreading across the floor in a dark crimson map. His face was angular. Sharp cheekbones. Dark eyes that had gone glassy and unfocused. Tattoos visible along his collarbones, written in a language she did not recognize. Gold watch on his left wrist, catching the fluorescent diner light even as his body shut down. He was dying. "Do something," one of the suited men said. His voice cracked like broken glass. This was Rocco, though Aria did not know his name. She would not know his name for another 72 hours. "Boss, stay with us." "Stay with." "Compressions," Aria said. She was already moving. Tearing off her winter coat, the thin one that had cost $8 at a thrift store 2 years ago. The one that had kept her alive through 3 San Francisco winters. "Someone find me something to press against the wound. Now." The second man, Sal, grabbed napkins from the closest table. Dozens of them. Aria took them without looking at his face, without seeing the shock written there like a sentence. She pressed the napkins against the bullet hole. They soaked through in seconds. Blood turned white paper red. His breathing had stopped. Aria placed her palms on his chest, on that expensive suit, on the body beneath that was growing cold, and began compressions. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm of staying alive. The rhythm of refusing to let someone disappear into the dark while you still had breath left to give. Her hand shook. Not from fear. From something else entirely. From the knowledge that this man, this stranger, this dangerous-looking stranger whose expensive watch probably cost more than her monthly rent, was a human being. That he was dying. That she was the only thing standing between him and nothing. Compressions. 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 "Ambulance is for minutes out," Rocco said. His voice sounded far away. "Underwater." "For minutes, boss. Stay with us." For minutes stretched like an eternity. Aria's arms burned. Her eyes watered from the effort and the cold. The diner's heating had been broken for 3 weeks, and the December snow outside hammered against the windows with increasing violence, as if trying to break through. The temperature inside hovered just above freezing. Her breath came out in white clouds. His blood ran warm across her hands, the only heat left in his body. "Come on," she whispered. Not to him. To something bigger. To the universe. To whatever force decided who lived and who died on a snow-thick night in San Francisco. "Come on." His eyes fluttered open. For one heartbeat, they focused. Dark brown. Intelligent. Searching. Looking directly at her as if he was trying to memorize her face. As if he was trying to say something that his broken body could not form into words. Then they closed again. 3 minutes, Sal said. 3 minutes. 180 seconds. Aria kept pressing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The rhythm that meant life. The rhythm that meant refusal. The sirens approached. She heard them before she saw the lights, a wail cutting through the snow-heavy air like a blade through silence. Red and white flashing across the frozen windows. The ambulance pulled up to the diner entrance, tires spinning slightly on the snow. Paramedics burst through the door in a controlled chaos of motion. Heavy bags. Practiced hands. Words like a foreign language. Gunshot wound. Yeah. How long? Just under 4 minutes of compressions. Blood type. And then they were looking at her. 2 paramedics in dark uniforms, their eyes asking a question without words. How did you know to do this? Why did you not run? AB negative, Aria said. She realized she was still on her knees. Her jeans were soaked through with his blood. I'm AB negative. You need blood. The paramedics exchanged a look. In that moment, she saw something shift in their faces. Recognition, maybe. Of the kind of courage that does not make sense. The kind that jumps into the dark without thinking. We have typo in the ambulance, the first paramedic said. But if you're willing. Yes. No hesitation. No thought. No moment where she calculated risk or consequence. She simply knew this man was dying and she was the only one in this room who could save him. Yes. Whatever you need. They moved him onto the stretcher with practiced efficiency. Started and 4. Had her sit down on a chair when had she sat down and rolled up her sleeve. The needle went in smooth. She watched her blood flow into the bag, watched the plastic fill with red. That was her blood. The thing keeping her alive. Going into him. And she did not know who he was. She did not know that his name was Luca Bianchi. She did not know that he controlled a criminal empire stretching from the docks of San Francisco to the mountains beyond. She did not know that Rocco and Sal had been standing in that diner because their boss had enemies. She did not know that the bullet in his ribs had been meant to end him, and that her hands, shaking and desperate and belonging to a woman worth less than his watch, had rewired fate itself. She did not know any of this. All she knew was, will he be okay? St. Mary's is 7 minutes out, the paramedic said, not answering the question. Which was an answer in itself. You ride with us? We should monitor you after the donation. Aria nodded. She was already standing. She had spent the night shift at the diner from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., $40 in tips if she was lucky, usually worse. She should have gone home to Emma. To her daughter, age 7, asleep in Mrs. Chen's apartment 3 blocks away. She should have slept. She should have counted the money in her pockets again, reconfirming the math she had already done 100 times. $34. That was all she had left. $34 to feed Emma and her son Marcus for 3 more days. The rent was due in 7 days, $22,000. A number so large it stopped being real after a while. Just abstract numbers on a notice that sat in her coat pocket like a live coal. But none of that mattered right now. She climbed into the ambulance behind the stretcher. The paramedics were working, feeding 4 lines, calling out numbers she did not understand. The man's eyes remained closed. His chest rose and fell. They had put some kind of mask over his face, but barely. Like he was falling towards sleep and might not wake up. The ambulance pulled into the snow and siren song filled the night. Aria watched the man's face. Studied it. As if she could will him to live through sheer attention. As if her eyes watching could make the difference between the light leaving his body and returning to it. She did not know that in exactly 72 hours, his eyes would open in a hospital room and land on her, and something in her would break in a way it had never broken before. She did not know that her act of desperate compassion, reaching out to a stranger when she should have turned away, would change everything about her life. The walls of it. The shape of it. The people who inhabited it. All she knew, in that spinning ambulance filled with the sound of machines keeping him tethered to breath, was that she had done the right thing. And that sometimes, that was enough. 3 hours earlier, Aria Reynolds stood in the darkness of her studio apartment and counted $34. $1 bill. $5 bill. A collection of ones and quarters and dimes that she had collected like shattered pieces of a life that used to make sense. She spread them across the small kitchen table in the darkness because she could not afford to turn on the overhead light more than once a day, and she had already used that allowance. The street light from the window below provided enough illumination. Just enough to see the truth. $34. She was 29 years old and she looked 45. The mirror had stopped lying to her about 3 years ago. The woman looking back had eyes that had forgotten joy. Skin that had forgotten moisture. Hair that had forgotten shine. She had stopped fighting the mirror and started accepting it as fact. This was what survival looked like. This was what 7 years of terror and 4 years of desperate poverty carved into a face. Her apartment was small. Smaller than small. A studio in a building that should have been condemned, in a neighborhood that cops only visited when they had no choice. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbors breathing through them. The floor was stained with things she tried not to think about. The single window looked out onto an alley where rats congregated and broken glass caught what little light the city provided. But it was hers. She paid $1,200 a month in rent, which was impossible, which was why the notice had come 3 weeks ago with a red deadline printed in letters large enough to be seen from hell, $22,000 owing. 12 days to vacate. 12 days. She had counted them every morning since. Mama. A small voice came from the corner of the apartment, from the futon that served as both bedroom and living room. Are you counting again? Aria turned away from the table. Her daughter Emma, age 7, was sitting up in the darkness. She wore a threadbare nightgown that had once been pink. Her hair was matted on one side from sleep. She had her father's dark eyes, the father who had walked out when Emma was 3 months old and had never looked back. Go back to sleep, baby, Aria said. Her voice came out soft. Careful. Like she was handling something precious and fragile. It's too early. You're worried. Emma stated this as fact. Children have a way of doing that. Of cutting through lie directly to truth. You count when you're worried. Aria moved to the futon and lay down beside her daughter. Emma immediately pressed against her, seeking warmth. She was so small. Still small enough that Aria could wrap her arms around her and feel like she was protecting something. She had learned not to believe in that protection much anymore. But the instinct remained. We're okay, Aria whispered. We'll be okay. She did not believe it. But she said it anyway. Outside, the November wind hammered against the window like a thing with teeth. Tomorrow was Friday. She would work a double shift at the diner, 14 hours for $40 in tips if she was lucky, usually 30. She would come home at midnight. She would sleep for hours. She would wake up and do it again on Saturday. On Sunday she had a cleaning job at a hotel downtown that paid minimum wage for 6 hours of work. That was $70. That was enough to feed Emma and Marcus for 1 more week. But the eviction notice. The notice with 12 days burning like a countdown. She did not have $22,000. She did not have $2,000. She did not have a plan beyond the next 48 hours, and even that plan was held together with lies she told herself and promises she was not sure she could keep. Emma fell asleep against her chest. Aria lay in the darkness and counted her heartbeats because she had learned long ago that it was the only thing she could control. The beating of her own heart. The rhythm of staying alive. The radiator clanged to life in the hallway. The sound of the building settling into pre-dawn cold. The wind continuing its assault on the window. And somewhere across the city, in a penthouse that cost more than Aria would make in 50 years, a man named Luca Bianchi was receiving a phone call that would send him to a diner at 3 in the morning. He did not know it yet. But the chess pieces were moving. The night was already in motion. And in exactly 3 hours and 22 minutes, the lives of two people who had never met would collide in the checkered linoleum and fluorescent light of a place designed to serve the desperate. The laundromat at Market Street glowed with the sickly yellow of fluorescent tubes that had been burning for decades, casting everything in shades of exhaustion. Washing machines churned in rhythmic misery. The air hung thick with steam and the chemical ghost of detergent, mixing with the smell of other people's lives, their sweat, their perfume, their small accumulated failures. Aria Reynolds folded a stranger's towel at 11:53 p.m. Her hands moved automatically, muscle memory carved deeper than thought. Fold. Stack. Fold. Stack. The work required nothing from her mind, which meant her mind was free to calculate. Free to panic. Free to drown. $34. 3/4. 2 dimes. She counted the money in her coat pocket 3 times, as if the number might change, as if mathematics were negotiable. The coins were cold against her palm, real in a way that the rest of her life was not. Outside, snow hammered against the windows like something trying to break in. She could see the street beyond, empty except for wind and whiteness. No one sane was out in this weather. No one sane was working a laundromat job at midnight for $7 an hour. But Aria Reynolds had stopped being sane the moment Douglas Hale put his first fist through her ribs 8 years ago. She pulled the eviction notice from her bag with the careful movements of someone handling a wound. The paper was thin, official, printed in red ink that looked like blood. Final notice. Amount due, $22,000. 7 days to vacate or face forced removal. The word swam in her vision. $22,000. Not 12 days to leave. 7 days to pay. After that, the city would remove her and her children like they were garbage that had accumulated in the building's corner. She worked 3 jobs. 3. The laundromat paid minimum wage, $7 an hour, 4 hours a night. That was $28. On Tuesday and Wednesday she worked the night cleaning shift at a downtown office building, 6 hours for $45. On Friday and Saturday she washed dishes at the diner on Valencia Street, 14 hours for whatever tips fell into her apron, usually $30 if she was fortunate, sometimes nothing if the customers were cruel. Her feet had blisters on blisters. The skin had worn through the calluses and started bleeding into her socks. She could feel it now, the wet warmth, the body's quiet protest against what it was being forced to do. But she did not stop folding. The woman who owned the laundromat, Mrs. Kim, sat in the back office doing math that probably looked similar to Aria's, small columns of numbers that did not add up to survival. Mrs. Kim paid cash every night because she did not want to acknowledge that she was participating in paying human beings less than a living wage. The money was real, though. The money was the only honest thing in Aria's life. You worked, you got paid, you bought food, the children ate. The arithmetic was as true as gravity. Midnight arrived like a sentence being carried out. Aria clocked out, pulled her thin coat around her shoulders, the coat that had been someone else's 5 winters ago, purchased at a Goodwill for $2, and walked into the blizzard. 40 minutes to get home. The Tenderloin was not a safe neighborhood, but it was a cheap neighborhood, and cheap was the only thing Aria could afford. The snow fell so thick that the streetlights became ghosts. Visibility 50 feet at most. The wind cut through her coat as if the fabric were nothing, which it might as well be. She had not eaten since a sandwich someone had left on a table at the diner that afternoon. She had picked it up, looked around to make sure no one was watching, and eaten it in the bathroom. The bread was stale. The turkey was beginning to brown at the edges. It was the best thing she had eaten all week. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like boiling cabbage and old grief. 1 room. Water stain on the ceiling that had spread since summer. The heater clanked and produced occasional warmth like it was a miracle. Mrs. Chen from downstairs was sitting on the plastic chair by the window, wrapped in a blanket, watching Emma and Jack sleep. Emma was 6 years old, Jack was 3. Emma lay on a mattress on the floor, her arm around Jack's small form like she was protecting something precious. She was protecting something precious. She was protecting the only other person in the world who mattered more than her own survival. Aria paid Mrs. Chen the last $8 from her pocket, leaving $26 between her and absolute ruin. "He came by," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "The man. He stood outside the building for 20 minutes. The world tilted. When? 8 o'clock. I turned off the lights. I made sure the children were not visible from the window. Douglas. Douglas had found this address. Douglas always found her. She had left him 6 months ago, left after the night his fists put her in the hospital with 3 fractured ribs and a concussion that made the left side of her face numb for 6 weeks. She had left with only the clothes on her back and the children's documents. She had gone to the police station. She had shown them the scars that ran in every direction across her back like a map of hell. The officer had taken a report. The officer had told her to consider a restraining order, as if a piece of paper could stop a man from following her. As if the law protected women like her. She had called the police for other times. They never came. Douglas owned a construction company. He owned connections. He owned the kind of money that made police officers available or unavailable depending on what he wanted. She had seen him near her workplace 3 times this month. She had started varying her routes, staying in public places, never walking the same path twice. But he was patient. He had all the time in the world and he knew she had nowhere to run. "Thank you," Aria whispered. "I'm sorry he frightened you." "I am not frightened," Mrs. Chen said. "But you should be careful. Men like that do not accept goodbye." At 2:11 a.m. Aria left for her overnight cleaning shift. She kissed Emma's forehead and Jack's forehead and did not let herself think about what would happen if Douglas found them while she was gone. She walked through the blizzard toward the financial district, toward the glassy office buildings where she scrubbed floors for a company that would never acknowledge her name. The snow stuck to her eyelashes. Her feet moved automatically. Her mind was somewhere else, somewhere dark, calculating how long she had before everything collapsed. She arrived at the building at 2:40 a.m. She clocked in. She pulled on the plastic gloves. She started mopping floors on the 42nd story, walking past dark offices where people made in a single day what she made in a month. The window showed the city below, buried in white, indifferent to her existence. At 3:15 a.m., something shifted in her chest. A need that overrode logic. She needed coffee. She could not afford coffee. She needed it anyway. There was a diner 3 blocks away on Hayes Street. The Golden Dawn it was called, though there was nothing golden about it, just chipped vinyl booths and a counter where people like her came to pretend for 30 minutes that they were not drowning. She left the cleaning shift early. She would go back and finish her shift, finish mopping the executive bathrooms and the break rooms where people threw away food that could have fed her children for a week. But first, she needed something warm in her stomach. She needed to sit down for 5 minutes and exist as something other than a body that worked. She walked into the Golden Dawn at 3:19 a.m. The diner was almost empty. A couple in a corner booth, their eyes on each other, unaware of the rest of the world. An old man nursing coffee by the window, reading a newspaper from yesterday. The waitress was texting behind the counter. The place smelled like bacon grease and the ghost of 1,000 dinners, a smell Aria associated with survival, with this small room being the only shelter available to people like her. She sat in a booth near the back and ordered black coffee. $2. She had it. She had $24 now. The waitress brought the coffee and left without making eye contact. Aria wrapped her hands around the cup and breathed the steam. The warmth was almost painful against her cold skin. She closed her eyes and let herself exist in this moment, not the past with Douglas, not the future with eviction, just this moment of heat and stillness and the temporary illusion of safety. At 3:22 a.m., the front door to the diner exploded inward. The couple in the corner booth jerked apart. The old man's newspaper rustled. But Aria did not move. She did not react. She had learned how to become invisible in rooms full of men, how to make her breath small, her heartbeat quieter, her presence something they would forget the moment they stopped looking at her. Two men entered first, both wearing tailored black suits despite the hour, despite the weather, despite the fact that they looked like they had never been cold in their lives. Both were tall, with a kind of muscular build that came from years of standing in doorways and making sure people knew they should not pass. Both had eyes that were empty of mercy. Behind them came a third man. He was tall, 6'2" at least, with broad shoulders that the fabric of his coat could barely contain. The coat was cashmere, dove grey, worth more than everything Aria owned in the world. His hair was dark, nearly black, and slicked back from a face that had been carved from something harder than flesh. He had the kind of age that was difficult to place. He could have been 35 or 50, one of those men whose power had made him ageless. A scar ran from his right temple to his cheekbone, white against tanned skin, and when he moved it was with the absolute control of someone who never wasted motion. She did not know him. She had no reason to know him. But her body recognized danger. The two men in suits moved toward a booth. The tall man in the cashmere coat was behind them, and even from her peripheral vision Aria could sense something wrong about him, something that did not fit with the fluorescent lights and the chipped vinyl and the smell of bacon grease. He moved like he owned the space, like the diner existed only because he had decided to allow it to exist. Aria looked away. She looked down at her coffee. She made herself small. The three men sat in the booth behind her. She heard the soft sound of a briefcase opening. She heard one of the men begin to speak in low, urgent Italian. She heard the word shipment and port and delayed. She heard tension in the air that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with money and power and the kind of stakes that people like Aria read about in newspapers but never expected to witness. The waitress brought menus. No one ordered food. Aria sipped her coffee. Her hands had stopped shaking. Her body had decided this was not her problem, not her danger, not something that would touch her life. She was a ghost in this diner. She was invisible. She was safe as long as she remained small. At 3:26 a.m., the front door opened again. A man entered. Not tall. Not remarkable. Just a man in a dark jacket with his hand already reaching inside his coat. For a moment, nothing happened. The diner existed in a frozen moment where everyone understood that something terrible was about to occur, but the motion had not yet begun. Then the gunshot. It was louder than Aria's mind had prepared for, not a sound but a physical force that punched through the air and shattered the leftover piece of the early morning. The man in the dark jacket had a gun. The man in the cashmere coat, the one in the booth behind her, had suddenly jerked forward. Red was blooming across his ribs, spreading like a terrible flower opening. The couple in the corner booth screamed. The old man dropped his newspaper. The waitress ran toward the back. And Aria found herself standing without remembering how she had stood, moving toward the wounded man without remembering that she had decided to move. The man in the cashmere coat was bleeding onto the checkered linoleum. His face had gone pale, but his eyes were still conscious, still burning with something that looked like rage and disbelief, the expression of someone who had never been vulnerable enough to bleed in a public place. The two men in suits were reaching for weapons. But Aria was already pressing her palms against the wound. She could feel the heat of his blood. She could feel the shirt beneath her hands, expensive fabric turning dark. She could feel his body, suddenly fragile, suddenly human, suddenly capable of the same damage as any other body. She did not think about who he was. She did not think about what he might be. She thought only that he was dying and she was the only person between his chest and the void. She pressed down and began to count. 1, 2, 3, 4. The CPR rhythm her mother had taught her years ago, the only useful thing she had ever learned in a first aid video at a shelter. Keep the rhythm. Do not stop. Someone had called 911. She could hear sirens in the distance, approaching through the snow. The man looked at her. His eyes were locked on her face, and in that moment something shifted in both of them, a recognition that had nothing to do with knowing and everything to do with understanding that this moment was already changing everything. The paramedics had Luca on a stretcher in 90 seconds. Oxygen mask. For lines. His skin the color of old bone. One of them was shouting about blood type, AB negative. They needed AB negative. It was rare, dangerously rare, and the hospital was 20 minutes away in this blizzard. The ambulance doors were closing. Luca's eyes fluttered open for just a moment, and in that moment they found Aria standing there with his blood drying on her hands, and something passed between them, a current of recognition that had nothing to do with knowing each other's names and everything to do with the fact that she had chosen to save him when she had no reason to risk herself. Then he was gone. The diner fell silent except for the wind hammering the windows and the distant sound of the ambulance swallowed by the storm. Rocco stood frozen, his massive frame trembling. Sal was on his phone, voice shaking. The cook peered out from the kitchen. The couple who had screamed was already pushing through the door, fleeing into the freezing night. Aria stood alone in the middle of the checkered floor, staring at her hands, which looked like they belonged to someone else. Blood under her fingernails. Blood soaking through the cuffs of her sweater. Blood that was keeping Luca Bianchi alive somewhere in an ambulance speeding through San Francisco streets. Rocco turned to her slowly, like he was moving through water. His eyes were the size of dinner plates. He was a man who had seen violence, who had ordered violence, who had watched his boss shoot people in the back of the head without flinching. But he had never seen anyone save his boss's life. He had never seen a woman half his size, wearing a coat so thin you could see the outline of her ribs through it, move faster than his trained instincts, move faster than survival, move into danger the way other people move toward warmth. "What's your name?" Rocco's voice was barely a whisper. "Aria. Aria Reynolds." Her own voice sounded far away, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. Rocco reached into his jacket. Aria flinched. But he was only pulling out cash. $500 bills. He pressed them into her shaking hand, and his hand was so much larger than hers that the money nearly fell. "You saved our boss's life," Rocco said, and every word carried the weight of an oath. "He will remember. The Bianchi family remembers debts. You saved Luca Bianchi, and we don't forget." Then they were gone, Rocco, Sal, the black SUV dissolving into the snow like a ghost that had never been there at all. Aria stood holding $500. $500 was a month's rent. $500 was Emma's medication for 3 months. $500 was the difference between staying and sleeping on the street. She looked down at her hands again. The blood was already turning brown at the edges, oxidizing, becoming history. For days later, Aria was washing clothes at the laundromat on Fillmore Street when the black SUV pulled up outside. Through the foggy window she could see it, identical to the one from the diner, identical to 1,000 other vehicles in a city full of wealth and power and danger. Her stomach dropped like a stone into dark water. The door opened. Rocco stepped out, his silhouette vast against the streetlight. He looked directly at her through the window, and Aria felt Emma's small hand reach for her coat pocket. "It's okay, baby," Aria whispered, but her voice shook. "It's okay." It wasn't okay. Nothing about this was okay. She carried the laundry basket to the door. Rocco was already opening it for her, his massive frame filling the doorway. "Mr. Bianchi wants to see you," he said. His tone wasn't a request. It was a summons phrased politely for the benefit of a child watching from the laundromat floor. "No." Aria's hand found Emma's shoulder, pulled her close. "I don't want any trouble." "No trouble," Rocco said, and he meant it. "He just wants to thank you properly." "I don't want thanks. I want to go home." Aria took a step back. The laundry basket was getting heavy. The blizzard outside was turning vicious, wind pushing against the windows like something alive and angry. Then a second voice, from the SUV, low and calm and infinitely more dangerous than any shout could be, "Please." Luca Bianchi emerged from the back seat like a man rising from the grave. He was moving carefully, yes, his right side favoring his ribs where the bullet had gone in, but he was moving. The expensive black coat hung from his shoulders like it had been tailored for exactly this moment. Snowflakes were catching in his dark hair, each one a small miracle of whiteness against the Italian-Korean features of his face. His eyes were the color of a winter storm, and they were locked on Aria's face with an intensity that made it difficult to breathe. "I owe you my life," Luca said. His voice was steady, unmarred by weakness. "I only want to thank you properly. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." Emma pressed harder against Aria's leg. The laundry basket cut into her palms. Aria was 32 years old, had made thousands of bad decisions in thousands of desperate moments, had learned to distrust every kind of kindness because kindness was usually just cruelty wearing a gentle face. But something in Luca's eyes, something raw and honest and wounded, made her nod. "Emma has to come with me," she said. "Of course," Luca replied. The drive took 12 minutes. They traveled north, up into the hills where the city lights spread below them like fallen stars. The black SUV climbed roads that Aria had never been on, past gates and security and men in dark clothes who nodded when the car passed. Then the mansion appeared through the blizzard, a towering structure of marble and glass and architectural ambition, a building that existed in a different universe than the studio apartment where Aria had spent the last 8 years. She had never been inside anywhere like this. The marble floor of the entry hall was so polished she could see herself reflected in it, a ghost, a shadow, a woman who did not belong. Emma's eyes went round. A staff member took her wet coat. Another offered hot chocolate that Emma accepted with visible gratitude, because hot chocolate was not something they had at home. Luca led them to a private study. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the blizzard outside like a painting. A fire crackled in the fireplace, filling the room with warmth that made Aria's skin ache. The leather furniture looked like it cost more than her entire apartment. Books lined the walls, real books, not the borrowed ones from the library with the date stamps on the due date slips. "Please sit," Luca said, gesturing to the couch. Aria sat on the edge. Emma settled beside her, clutching the hot chocolate like it was the most precious thing anyone had ever given her. Luca remained standing, his expression unreadable. "I need to understand why you helped me. You didn't know who I was. You could have walked away like everyone else did. But you didn't. Why?" The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind howled and scraped against the windows. "Because you were dying," Aria said. "And I was the only one who could save you." Luca studied her face for a long moment. "What do you need?" he asked. "Nothing," Aria said immediately. "You gave me your blood," Luca replied. His voice was not angry, but it was absolute. "You saved my life. In my family, that creates a debt. A serious debt. So I'm asking you again. What do you need?" Aria's phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She didn't check it, but her whole body went rigid. Luca saw it. Luca saw everything. He had survived this long in his world because he read people the way other men read books. He said, "You're in trouble." Aria said, "I'm fine." But her voice broke on the word fine, and Luca crossed the room and knelt in front of her, actually knelt, so that they were at the same eye level, and said quietly, "I grew up with a violent father. I know what fear sounds like. Tell me." And Aria, who had not told anyone the truth about her life in years, who had learned to smile and lie and pretend and survive, told him everything. Douglas Hale. 8 years of his fists. 8 years of apologies followed by flowers followed by violence on a pattern so regular you could set a clock by it. The scars on her back that looked like maps of a country she had never wanted to visit. The eviction notice with the red deadline 12 days away. $22,000 in debt. The job she lost 2 days ago because Douglas's sister called her employer and made accusations that were technically false but close enough to the truth that they felt true. "I have $34 to my name," Aria whispered. "If I had been 1 day slower finding that 500, I was sleeping on the street last week." Emma was sleeping on the street. "I don't know what I'm going to do." Luca listened without interrupting. His hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. When she finished, he stood and turned to Rocco, who had been standing by the door the entire time. Find Douglas Hale. I want everything. Where he works, where he lives, every person who protects him, every secret he has kept. I want it by tomorrow. Rocco nodded and left the room. Sal, who had been standing silent beside the fireplace, watched his boss with eyes full of something like fear. In 15 years of working for Luca Bianchi, Sal had never heard him speak that way about anyone. The $22,000 is handled, Luca said. You and Emma will stay here. You will be safe. This I promise. I can't accept that, Aria said. I don't want charity. It's not charity, Luca replied. It's a debt. You saved my life. Now I save yours. Outside, the blizzard intensified, wind screaming like a living thing, and somewhere in the city Douglas Hale was making a phone call to his sister Diana, saying, she's at the Bianchi mansion. The mob boss is harboring her. We need to move now. The blizzard had teeth. Wind screamed against the mansion's iron gates like a living thing demanding entry, and at midnight, Douglas Hale arrived with 4 men and a gun that trembled in his frozen hand. Snow swallowed the world. Visibility had collapsed to nothing. The guards at the gate didn't hesitate. They called Rocco, who called Luca, who was standing in the library holding a book he wasn't reading when the phone rang. He's here, Rocco said. 2 words. That was all Luca needed. Luca set the book down on the mahogany table, button by button closing his black cashmere coat, the fabric worth more than Aria's entire year of survival. He descended the marble stairs without hurrying. His men moved like water around him, Rocco on his left, Sal on his right, 12 more positioning themselves in the shadows of the mansion's outer walls, unseen, waiting. The cold air hit him first, then the sound. Douglas Hale was screaming her name into the blizzard. Aria! Aria, get out here! You belong to me! The words came fractured between sobs, between the crack of his own voice breaking under the weight of 8 years of ownership finally slipping through his fingers like sand. Douglas was drunk. His breath came in visible clouds. His eyes were the eyes of a man watching his property burn. Luca walked forward until he stood 10 feet from Douglas, snow accumulating on his shoulders, his face showing no temperature, no fear, no mercy. Just ice. Just the careful, measured stillness of a predator who had already decided how this would end. You will leave now, Luca said. His voice was deep and solid like an oath. Or you will not leave at all. Douglas lunged. It took 3 seconds. 3. Rocco moved like his name, like a rock slide, all momentum and weight and absolute inevitability. He disarmed Douglas before the man's hand had fully extended, the gun clattering into the snow, useless, powerless, just like its owner. The 4 men with Douglas didn't even draw. They understood in that moment what it meant to face the wrong family on the wrong night on the wrong side of the law. Douglas fell to his knees in the snow. His face contorted. The tears that came were not the tears of a man who loved, they were the tears of a man watching his empire collapse, watching his control dissolve, watching the woman he had carved maps of pain into choose another man, another life, another world entirely. Please, Douglas whispered. Please, I love her. She belongs to me. Please. Luca knelt to his eye level. The snow around them was pristine white except for the place where Douglas knelt, where his tears fell and froze on his own cheeks, where his body shook with a rage that was already becoming fear. Love does not leave scars, Luca said. Each word was a blade. Love does not make people count pennies wondering if they can feed their children. Love does not destroy. You did not love her. You broke her. There is a difference. And now you will learn what it means to be broken. Luca stood. He nodded once to Rocco. From the shadows emerged 12 men, and they moved like ghosts, not Luca's men, but men from the Constantine family, men from the Soto clan, men from organizations that Luca had called in favors from, organizations that had scores to settle with Douglas Hale that went back years, back to deals made and broken, to territory disputed, to disrespect accumulated. They emerged from the blizzard like the blizzard itself had taken human form, methodical, silent, unstoppable. Douglas screamed. He screamed Aria's name. He screamed for mercy. He screamed until the van door closed and the sound was swallowed by the engine starting and the tires rolling forward through the snow and into the night, carrying him toward a place where disappearing was exactly what happened to men who thought they owned women. Luca turned back toward the mansion without watching the van leave. What he felt in his chest was not satisfaction. It was not justice. Justice would have been a courtroom, a jury, a verdict. What this was something older. Something that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with the understanding that some men do not deserve courts. Some men deserve to vanish. Rocco fell into step beside him. The Constantine family will handle the rest. He will not surface again. Not in this city. Not in this life. Good, Luca said. What came next was Diana. 19 hours later, at 6 in the morning, federal agents knocked on the penthouse door of Diana Whitfield's luxury apartment in the financial district, and they did not knock gently. The cameras were waiting. The news vans were positioned. Luca had provided everything: 8 years of financial crimes, documented, photographed, time-stamped, irrefutable. Bribery. Conspiracy. Fraud on a scale that made the federal prosecutors' hands shake as they read through the files. Diana answered the door in silk pajamas the color of cream. Her hair was perfect. Her nails were perfect. In the next 30 seconds, none of it would matter. The lead agent showed the warrant. Diana's face went white, then red, then a color that didn't have a name. She tried to close the door. There were 12 agents. The door did not close. They walked her to the elevator in her silk pajamas with cameras flashing, her face contorted, her mouth moving but no words coming out, just the shape of denial. By noon, every news outlet in the city had run the photograph. The woman who had destroyed Aria Reynolds' reputation now watching her own reputation explode on live television. The social circles she had weaponized, the connection she had cultivated like a garden of thorns, now turned their backs with the speed of predators abandoning wounded prey. 3 hours after the arrest, her lawyer called to tell her the verdict that everyone already knew: 40 years. Federal prison. 40 years of cells and concrete, and the understanding that the woman she had tried to erase had instead been the one to erase her. Her wealth was frozen. Her properties seized. Her name became synonymous with corruption so complete that charities returned her donations and society pages deleted her from their archives. Systematic destruction. Not death, which would have been too quick, too easy, too merciful. But obliteration. Complete and total annihilation of everything she valued. But none of this happened before the lowest moment. The moment that came the night before Douglas appeared at the gates. Aria stood on the mansion balcony at 2 in the morning, the blizzard still howling, snow stinging her face like tiny accusations. Inside, Emma and Jack slept in beds they had never imagined existing. Warm beds. Safe beds. Beds that didn't squeak or smell like mold or require her to lie awake listening for footsteps. But Aria could not sleep. She could not stop thinking about the 8 years. 8 years of fists. 8 years of waiting for the next time. 8 years of her body learning that safety was a luxury reserved for other women. $22,000. How would she ever repay that? How would she ever be anything except a woman who had been saved, a woman who had been broken, a woman who was fundamentally and irreversibly damaged? She gripped the railing. The cold bit through her skin. It would be easy, she thought. So easy. Just one step. Emma and Jack would be better off without her. Luca had money. He could hire nannies. He could give them the life they deserved, the life they could never have with her, the broken woman who counted pennies and accepted handouts and wore her failure like a second skin. She stepped closer to the edge. Then, a small sound. A whisper. Emma's voice from the doorway behind her. "Mommy? Are you cold?" Emma stood there in pajamas that were still too big, rubbing her eyes with her fists, holding a blanket that she had pulled from her own bed. She was 5 years old and she had learned to sleep in luxury in 5 days. She was 5 years old and she understood somehow that her mother needed her more than she needed the warmth. Emma crossed the balcony and wrapped the blanket around her mother's shoulders. "I love you, Mommy," Emma said. "You're the best, Mommy." Colors for sad days. When you feel sad, look at this. She pulled a crayon drawing from her pajama pocket, wrinkled and worn, colors everywhere, a family holding hands beneath a sun that was far too large. Aria collapsed to her knees. The sobs came from somewhere deeper than her body, somewhere in the place where she had learned to be invisible, learned to be nobody, learned to accept that love came with bruises as accessories. She held Emma and wept, and in that moment, she chose to live. Not for herself. For this. For this small girl who had drawn a sun big enough to warm every shadow. 30 minutes later, Luca found them there, mother and daughter wrapped in a blanket on a freezing balcony during a blizzard. He didn't ask questions. He simply brought them inside, made hot chocolate with his own hands, sat with them until Emma fell asleep in Aria's lap, her small head resting against her mother's chest, breathing the breath of a child who finally felt safe. And Luca understood something in that moment, something that had nothing to do with business or power or the empire he had built from blood and loyalty. He understood that Aria had saved him from a bullet wound. But he had saved her from something worse. From the slow, invisible death of believing that she was nobody. From the belief that the world was better off without her. Somewhere in the city, Douglas Hale was beginning to understand what it meant to disappear. Somewhere in a penthouse, Diana Whitfield was being photographed in handcuffs. Somewhere in federal buildings, lawyers were filing paperwork that would lock both of them away from the world they had tried to own. But here, on this balcony, in this mansion, in this moment where a mother held her daughter and a powerful man held them both, something else was happening. Something that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with mercy. Something that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with redemption. The blizzard outside continued its assault on the world, but inside the mansion, there was warmth. There was safety. There was the understanding that one hand reached out at exactly the right moment can change an entire life. 2 weeks had passed since the blizzard stopped falling and Douglas Hale vanished into the night like smoke dissolving into air. The mansion's library was flooded with winter sunlight now, pale and thin but real, and Aria Reynolds sat in a leather chair that cost more than every piece of furniture she had ever owned, holding a folder with trembling hands. Emma and Jack played with wooden blocks on the floor, their laughter a sound she had almost forgotten was possible, bright, uncomplicated, safe. Luca Bianchi entered without announcement. He never did announce himself. He simply appeared, the way powerful men do, and in the past 14 days Aria had stopped flinching at his arrivals. He sat across from her, his tall frame folding into the chair with the fluid grace of someone who had learned long ago that movement was a language. His dark eyes, the color of winter water, fixed on her face. "Open it," he said. His voice was quiet. Like stone settling. She opened the folder. Inside was a deed. A house in the Mission District, 3 bedrooms, a backyard with a fence Emma could play in. The house was in her name. Her name alone. Aria Reynolds. Owner. The word made no sense in her mind. Below that, a trust fund. $270,000. For Emma's education. For Jack's education. Numbers so large they stopped being real and became abstract, like looking at the sky. And below that, a job offer. Community Outreach Director for Bianchi Enterprises Legitimate Holdings. $45,000 per year. Health insurance. A 401k. Words from a world she had abandoned years ago when Douglas's fists had made planning futures impossible. Aria could not speak. Her throat had closed like a fist. "You can't accept this," she said finally, and the words came out fractured. "I already have," Luca replied. He leaned forward slightly, and she saw the movement for what it was, not threat but invitation. "You saved my life, Aria. On a checkered floor at 3 in the morning, you pressed your hands against a bullet wound and you stayed. You stayed when every rational person ran. This is me saving yours. We are even now. But they both knew that was not true. They were not even. Nothing could make them even, because somewhere in the past 2 weeks, between the late nights when Luca had sat in the library while she worked, between the moment she had watched him braid Emma's hair with the patience of a man learning a language he had never spoken, between the conversations about his father, a man who had beaten him until he learned that love was just another word for control, something had shifted. The scales had tipped. The math had changed. She did not say this aloud. That evening, as darkness settled against the windows like a held breath, Aria found herself asking the question she had been afraid to voice. Why did you really help me? You could have paid the money and sent me away. You could have closed that door and never seen me again. Luca was sitting by the window, silhouetted against the city lights. San Francisco spread below like diamonds scattered on black velvet. When he turned to face her, his expression was stripped bare of the careful neutrality he wore in public. Because you did not hesitate, he said. Everyone else ran. The customers in that diner, my own men frozen in shock, people who have known me for years and still chose survival over loyalty. You stayed. You bled for a stranger. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who only act when there is profit in it. You acted because it was right. That is rarer than you know, Aria. That is rarer than diamonds. She sat beside him, and the distance between them felt like a held breath. I was terrified, she whispered. I am still terrified. Of you, of this world, of losing my children again, of being broken so completely that I cannot be put back together. His hand found hers. Not suddenly. Not romantically. Just a man reaching across silence to hold the hand of a woman who had held his life together when it was spilling onto linoleum. I will never hurt you, he said. His voice was like an oath carved into stone. I will never let anyone hurt you again. You have my word, and unlike some men's promises, mine is written in something stronger than air. They did not kiss. They did not rush into the kind of romance that burns fast and collapses into ash. But they sat together in the library while Emma and Jack slept upstairs, and the silence between them was not empty. It was full of understanding. It was the silence of two people who had crawled through different kinds of fire and recognized the burns on each other's skin. 6 months later, Aria Reynolds stood in her own kitchen, modest, yellow-walled, nothing like the mansion but entirely hers, watching Emma and Jack play in the backyard through a window that did not shake in its frame. The eviction notice was long gone, burned or filed away in some cabinet of her old life. Douglas Hale had not been seen in 183 days. Federal agents had found him in a warehouse in Oakland, cowering in a corner, his empire crumbled, his money seized, his reputation destroyed in the way that only organized crime could destroy a man, systematically, completely, without mercy. Diana Whitfield sat in a federal prison in Nevada, serving the first year of a 40-year sentence. The newspapers had called it a scandal. The photographs of her being led away in handcuffs, her designer clothes replaced with an orange jumpsuit, her carefully constructed social standing reduced to nothing, those images had been broadcast across every news channel in California. By the end of the week, 3 million people had seen what happens when cruelty meets justice. Aria's scars were still there. Maps on her back that would never fully fade, reminders written in tissue and nerves. But she no longer touched them in shame. They were evidence. They were proof that she had survived. Luca visited often. Not as a boss. Not as a savior. But as a man who understood what it meant to crawl out of darkness because someone reached down a hand and held on. One evening, as autumn painted the city gold and red, he arrived with something in his pocket. He did not get on one knee, he was not a man for grand gestures, and Aria would not have wanted one. Instead, he simply sat beside her on the porch while Emma and Jack played with chalk on the driveway, drawing suns and flowers in colors that seemed too bright to be real. I love you, he said. The words were simple. Not because you saved my life. Not because I saved yours. But because you chose to live, and you chose to let me live beside you while you did. She turned to him, and in that moment, she was not the woman who had counted $34 in a diner pocket. She was not the woman who had believed she was nobody. She was Aria Reynolds, director of community outreach, mother of 2 children who felt safe in their beds at night, owner of a house with a yellow kitchen and a backyard with a fence. "I love you too," she said. "Not because you gave me money or a house or a job, but because you saw me when I was invisible. You reached down into the darkness and you did not let go." He took her hand, and neither of them moved. They simply sat there on the porch, 2 people forged in different kinds of fire, learning that love could mean something other than pain. Learning that trust could mean something other than betrayal. Learning that sometimes, one hand reached out at exactly the right moment can change an entire life. The footsteps of Emma and Jack echoed across the porch as they ran inside to show their mother a drawing. The sound was ordinary. The sound was everything. In that drawing, done in marker and hope, was the yellow kitchen, the fence, the house, and 2 figures holding hands under a sun so bright it lit up the entire page. If this story moved you, please drop a like right now and share it with someone who needs to hear that there is hope even in the darkest moments. Subscribe and hit the bell because tomorrow we have another story that will remind you why love, courage, and justice matter. Comment below, what would you have done in Aria's position? Would you have helped a stranger bleeding on a diner floor? Let's talk in the comments. Thank you for watching until the very end. We wish you good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Remember, no matter how hard life gets, after the rain, the sky clears. See you in the next one.